Lisa Morgan walked through the bright white hallways of the Galactic Council station with her hands empty and her mind focused on the day ahead. The massive structure orbited around Nexus Prime like a metal moon, housing representatives from 200 different worlds and species. Each corridor buzzed with the sounds of alien languages and the soft hum of translation, devices working overtime to make sense of the chaos. She approached the security checkpoint that led to the Grand Council chamber and smiled at the Vraxian guard who nodded at her with all four of his eyes. The security scanner beeped once as she walked through, a simple confirmation that she carried no weapons or dangerous items. Behind her, she could hear the much longer and more complicated process that every other delegate had to endure. Ambassador Clef 9 from the Zephyrian system stood in line with obvious irritation written across his blue-scaled face. The security officers carefully removed his ceremonial bone spurs from his arms and legs, each one sharp enough to cut through steel. His forearms ended in natural claws that could slice through most known materials, so the guards fitted each finger with blunting caps made of soft polymer. The process took nearly 10 minutes and left the proud warrior looking diminished and uncomfortable. The Thoraxian representative fared even worse. Dr. Vex 12 had to undergo a painful procedure where her natural acid glands were temporarily neutralized with injection blockers. Her species could spray deadly acid from their fingertips when threatened, a defense mechanism that had helped them survive on their harsh homeworld for millions of years. The neutralization process made her feel sick and weak, but council rules were clear about biological weapons. Lisa watched the massive Brontok delegate next. General Thrak Prime stood nearly 12 feet tall, and his natural armor plating could deflect plasma rifle shots without leaving a mark. The security team attached mobility dampeners to his legs and arms, devices that would reduce his incredible strength to merely 10 times that of a human being. Even diminished, he could still accidentally crush most beings with a handshake, but the dampeners made him less of a walking weapons platform. The process continued down the line with each species, surrendering whatever natural advantages evolution had given them. The Etherians had their psychic amplifiers removed. The Crystallians had their energy projection nodes covered with dampening fields. The Void Swimmers had their phase-shifting abilities temporarily blocked with quantum inhibitors. Every single delegate except Lisa went through some form of neutralization before entering the chamber. She found her assigned seat in the human section of the Great Circular Chamber and settled in for what promised to be a long session. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering, with gravity fields adjusted for each species and atmospheric processors ensuring everyone could breathe comfortably. The central speaking platform could accommodate beings as small as the inch-tall, micro-collective representatives or as large as the gas giant dwelling sky whales. Lisa had been Earth's ambassador for 2 years now, but she still felt the weight of curious stares from other delegates. Some looked at her with confusion, others with barely hidden resentment, and a few with something that might have been respect. The question was always the same, spoken or unspoken. Why did humans get special treatment? Why were they the only species allowed to enter the chamber without surrendering their natural capabilities? The truth was that humans had very few natural capabilities to surrender. No claws, no armor, no poison glands, no psychic powers, no enhanced strength or speed. They were soft, slow, and fragile compared to almost every other species in the galaxy. When Earth first joined the Galactic Council 50 years ago, the security protocols had seemed unnecessary for such an obviously harmless species, but that had been before the incident on Varconia Prime, before the mediation at the Centauri border, before dozens of other conflicts where human diplomats had somehow managed to prevent wars that seemed inevitable. The galaxy had learned that being harmless and being weak were not the same thing. Council Speaker Prime Alpha called the session to order with a deep harmonic tone that vibrated through the chamber. The first items on the agenda were routine trade negotiations and border dispute mediations. Lisa listened with half her attention while keeping the other half focused on the subtle political currents flowing through the chamber. She could sense tension building around the human exemption issue several delegates had been pushing for. a formal review of the security protocols, specifically targeting humanity's special status. The Zephyrian faction had been the most vocal, arguing that the exemption created unfair advantages in negotiations. The warrior culture of Zephyria valued strength above all else, and they struggled to understand how a species without natural weapons could be so effective at preventing conflicts. The Thoraxians had their own concerns about human involvement in galactic affairs. Their hive-mind society operated on principles of collective decision-making that clashed with human individualism. They worried that human mediators disrupted the natural order of things by preventing conflicts that should be resolved through traditional dominance displays. Even some of humanity's allies had begun to question the arrangement. The Centauri Collective had benefited greatly from human mediation services, but their academic culture demanded logical explanations for everything. They wanted to understand the science behind human effectiveness in diplomatic situations. Lisa knew that today's session would likely address these concerns directly. Intelligence reports from Earth suggested that a formal challenge to the human exemption would be presented before the end of the week. The challenge would force the Council to either justify the special treatment or eliminate it entirely. The morning sessions passed without incident, covering standard trade agreements and resource allocation disputes. But Lisa could feel the anticipation building as the afternoon approached. Several delegates had requested speaking time for matters of general council policy, and she suspected she knew what those matters would concern. During the lunch break, she found herself approached by delegates from various species. Some were genuinely curious about human diplomatic methods. Others seemed to be testing her reactions to see how she might respond to a formal challenge. A few appeared to be offering support, though their motivations were unclear. Ambassador Sirem Prime from the Centauri Collective joined her at a quiet table in the diplomatic dining area. The tall, graceful being moved with the fluid motions characteristic of her species and spoke in the melodic tones that made Centauri poetry so famous throughout the galaxy. "The afternoon will bring interesting discussions," Sirem Prime said carefully, her large eyes watching Lisa's face for reactions. Lisa nodded and took a sip of the synthetic coffee that tasted almost like the real thing. Change is a constant in galactic politics. Earth is prepared to address any concerns the Council might have about our role in diplomatic affairs. Your people have prevented many conflicts over the years, the Centauri delegate continued. But some question whether your methods create dependency rather than genuine resolution. That's a fair concern, Lisa replied, though I would argue that preventing a war is valuable regardless of the methods used, as long as those methods don't cause harm to others. The conversation continued in the careful, indirect way of diplomatic discourse. Neither delegate said anything that could be considered a firm commitment or position, but both gathered useful information about the other's thinking. By the time they returned to the chamber, Lisa had a better understanding of the forces aligning against humanity's special status. The afternoon session began with the formal presentation of the challenge she had been expecting. Ambassador Clethnine rose from his seat and requested permission to address a matter of council policy. His voice carried the controlled aggression typical of Zephyrian speakers, and his recently reattached bone spurs gleamed under the chamber's lights. Lisa straightened in her chair and prepared to defend not just her species' position in the council, but their entire approach to galactic diplomacy. The next few hours would determine whether humans would continue to serve as mediators and peacekeepers, or whether they would be forced to find a new role in the complex politics of the galaxy. She touched the simple communication device on her wrist, sending a brief signal to Earth that the long-anticipated challenge had finally begun. 47 years earlier, Captain Jake Sullivan stood on the bridge of the Earth vessel Harmony and watched the twin moons of disputed territory, 7, grow larger on the main screen. The ship was small by galactic standards, barely 300 meters long and equipped with outdated fusion drives that most species had abandoned decades ago. But it carried something more valuable than advanced technology, a diplomatic mission that might prevent a war between two of the galaxy's most dangerous civilizations. The Varkonian Empire and the Centauri Collective had been building toward Conflict for months over control of the mineral-rich moons. The Varkonians claimed ancient territorial rights based on warrior conquests from thousands of years ago, while the Centauri argued for modern settlement rights based on their peaceful colonization efforts. Both sides had assembled fleets in the system, and intelligence reports suggested that fighting could break out at any moment. Earth had been asked to mediate the dispute, precisely because humanity was still considered a minor species with no stake in the outcome. 3 years into their membership in the Galactic Council, humans were seen as harmless neutrals who could be trusted by both sides. Captain Sullivan knew that this perception of weakness was both an advantage and a potential disaster waiting to happen. Signal from the Varkonian flagship, reported Communications Officer Amy Carter from her station near the back of the bridge. War Chief Gormuth wants to confirm the meeting location and time. Sullivan nodded and straightened his simple blue uniform. Human military dress looked almost primitive compared to the elaborate armor and ceremonial weapons worn by most galactic species, but it served its purpose. Send confirmation that we'll meet at the agreed coordinates on Moon 7 in 6 hours. Both delegations should arrive unarmed as previously negotiated. Security Chief Ryan Davis looked up from his tactical display with concern written across his weathered face. Sir, our intelligence suggests the Varkonians have no intention of honoring the unarmed agreement. Their shuttle is equipped with concealed weapons, and their warriors are carrying ceremonial blades that could easily be used in combat. What about the Centauri? Sullivan asked. They're following the agreement to the letter, Davis replied. No weapons, minimal security, and their delegation includes several civilian scientists and diplomats. If the Varkonians decide to turn this into a trap, the Centauri won't stand a chance. Amy turned from her communications console with additional information. Captain, I'm also picking up encrypted transmissions between the Varkonian ships. The translation software can't break their military codes, but the traffic pattern suggests they're coordinating some kind of operation. Sullivan walked to the forward observation window and looked out at the contested moons. Both worlds were scarred with mining operations and temporary settlements, physical evidence of the dispute that had brought them all here. He had studied both species extensively in preparation for this mission, and he understood the fundamental differences that made this conflict so dangerous. The Varkonians were a warrior culture that valued strength, honor, and territorial dominance above all else. They had conquered dozens of worlds through military might and governed their empire through a complex system of combat-based hierarchies. To them, the Centauri colonists were weak invaders who deserved to be driven off through force of arms. The Centauri collective operated on completely different principles. They were a peaceful species that preferred negotiation and compromise to violence. Their society was built around scientific advancement and cultural exchange, and they had established their settlements through careful legal procedures and council-approved colonization permits. They saw the Varkonian claims as ancient history. That had no bearing on modern territorial disputes? Sir, Davis said carefully, if this turns into a shooting war, our orders are clear. We're to evacuate immediately and report back to Earth Command. We don't have the firepower to intervene in a conflict between major galactic powers. Sullivan knew the security chief was right. The Harmony carried only basic defensive systems and a small complement of human marines armed with projectile weapons. That would be useless against Varkonian armor or Centauri energy shields. In a straight fight, the human ship would be destroyed in minutes by either side. But Sullivan also knew that running away would doom any chance of preventing a larger war. If the Varkonians massacred the Centauri delegation, the collective would respond with their full military might. The Varkonian Empire would see this as a declaration of war and mobilize their conquest fleets. Within weeks, dozens of worlds could be burning and millions of beings could die. Prepare a shuttle for the surface, Sullivan ordered. Full diplomatic kit, no weapons except emergency beacons. And prepare 2 additional emergency shuttles with medical supplies. Amy looked confused. Sir, the agreement calls for only 1 shuttle per side. Why do we need 3? Because I suspect we're going to need emergency medical evacuation for the Centauri delegation, Sullivan replied grimly. And possibly for ourselves as well. The next few hours passed in tense preparation. Sullivan reviewed everything he knew about Varkonian culture and psychology, looking for any advantage that might help him prevent the disaster he saw coming. Amy coordinated with both delegations to confirm landing procedures and meeting protocols. Davis conducted emergency drills with the small security team, though everyone knew that human weapons would be useless if violence broke out. As they approached the designated meeting site on Moon 7, the scope of the problem became clear. The Varkonian shuttle was a military transport designed for rapid assault operations, and thermal scans showed at least 30 warriors in full combat gear. The Centauri shuttle was a civilian research vessel carrying 12 diplomats and scientists, with no protective equipment beyond basic environmental suits. This is going to be a massacre, Davis muttered as he watched the tactical display. Sullivan made a decision that would later be studied in military academies and diplomatic schools throughout the galaxy, instead of following protocol and landing at the neutral zone between the two delegations. He ordered his pilot to set down directly between the Varkonian and Centauri shuttles. "Sir, that puts us in the line of fire if shooting starts," the pilot protested. "That's exactly the point," Sullivan replied. "If they want to kill each other, they'll have to go through us first." The human shuttle touched down on the rocky surface of Moon 7 with the two larger alien vessels on either side. Through the viewports, Sullivan could see Varkonian warriors emerging from their transport in powered armor that made them look like walking tanks. Their leader, War Chief Gormuth, stood nearly 10 feet tall and carried weapons that could level buildings from the other direction. The Centauri delegation approached with the cautious movements of beings who were already afraid for their lives. They wore simple environmental suits and carried only scientific instruments and diplomatic documents. Their leader, Scholar Prime Vex 9, looked fragile and vulnerable compared to the armored Varkonians. Sullivan walked down the shuttle ramp with Amy and Davis flanking him, and immediately understood why humans were considered such a minor species. Compared to the massive Varkonians or the graceful Centauri, the human delegation looked small, slow, and completely inadequate for the situation they were walking into. War Chief Gormuth strode forward with his warriors behind him, and Sullivan could see the contempt in the alien's eyes. To the Varkonian leader, humans were barely worth noticing, let alone respecting. The war chief's attention was focused entirely on the Centauri delegation, and Sullivan realized that Gormuth had already decided to abandon any pretense of negotiation. "Scholar Prime Vex 9, Gormuth announced in a voice that carried across the barren landscape. "Your people have violated ancient territorial claims and established illegal settlements on Varkonian lands. By the laws of conquest and the rights of empire, you will withdraw immediately or face the consequences of your trespass." The Centauri leader stepped forward with obvious fear, but also with dignity. "War Chief Gormuth, our settlements were established under proper council authority and international law. We came here in peace and have no desire for conflict. Surely we can find a solution that honors both our people's legitimate interests." Gormuth's response was to draw his ceremonial blade, a weapon that glowed with contained energy and could cut through most known materials. "There is no negotiation with thieves and invaders. You have 1 hour to begin evacuation procedures, or my warriors will remove you by force." The situation was deteriorating exactly as Sullivan had feared, but what happened next would change the course of galactic history. Instead of backing away or calling for evacuation, Captain Sullivan stepped forward and placed himself directly between the two delegations. "War Chief Gormuth," he said in a calm voice that somehow carried across the tension-filled space, "I understand your anger and the righteousness of your position. But I'm asking you to consider what happens after you drive off the Centauri colonists." Gormuth turned his attention to the human for the first time, and Sullivan could feel the weight of the warrior's contempt. "Human, you have no place in this discussion. Your species is weak and has no understanding of honor or conquest. War Chief Gormoth stared down at Captain Sullivan with a mixture of confusion and growing irritation. The massive Varkonian warrior had expected the weak human to flee when confronted with superior force, not stand his ground and request a conversation. Behind Gormoth, 30 armored warriors shifted restlessly, their weapons powered and ready for the combat they had been promised. "Speak quickly, human," Gormoth growled, his voice distorted by the combat armor speakers. "My patience grows thin and my warriors hunger for battle. If you have wisdom to offer, do so now before I decide that your interference requires a response." Sullivan looked up at the towering alien warrior and spoke with a steadiness that surprised even his own crew. "War Chief, I want to tell you about a battle that happened on my world many years ago. Two armies faced each other across a field, both convinced they were fighting for honor and justice. Both sides had legitimate grievances and both had warriors. As brave and skilled as any in your empire." Amy Carter and Ryan Davis watched their captain with growing alarm. They knew that Sullivan was taking an enormous risk by keeping the Varkonians' attention focused on himself, but they also understood that any wrong word could trigger the massacre they were trying to prevent. "The battle lasted 3 days," Sullivan continued, never breaking eye contact with Gormoth. "When it ended, thousands of warriors lay dead in the mud, and neither side had achieved anything that couldn't have been gained through negotiation. The real tragedy wasn't the deaths themselves, but what those deaths prevented. Every warrior who died that day could have built something instead of destroying it. Every family that lost a son or daughter was diminished for generations." Gormoth's grip on his energy blade tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Something in the human's tone suggested that this wasn't a story about weakness or cowardice, but about the price of strength used unwisely. "I'm not telling you this story because I think you're wrong to be angry," Sullivan said, stepping closer to the massive warrior despite the obvious danger. "The Centauri colonists did establish settlements without consulting your people's historical claims. Your anger is justified, and your desire to protect what belongs to your empire is honorable." Scholar Prime Vex 9 and the Centauri delegation watched this exchange with fascination. They had expected the human mediators to focus on legal procedures and diplomatic protocols, not on acknowledging the emotional validity of their opponent's position. "But War Chief," Sullivan continued, "what happens after you drive them away? The Centauri Collective has a fleet of ships in this system, and they won't accept the destruction of their delegation without response. Your empire will be drawn into a war that could last for decades and cost millions of lives on both sides." Gormoth raised his weapon, and for a moment it seemed like the standoff would end in violence. But instead of striking, he pointed the blade toward the Centauri delegation. "Then let them remember the price of challenging Varkonian territory. A short war now prevents a longer war later. Does it?" Sullivan asked, and something in his voice made even the Varkonian warriors pause. "War Chief, I've studied your empires history, and I know that your people value strength above all else. But I've also learned that the greatest warriors in Varkonian legend are remembered not just for their victories in battle, but for their wisdom in knowing when not to fight." Amy Carter realized what her captain was doing and felt a chill of recognition. Sullivan wasn't trying to appeal to Gormoth's mercy or sense of justice. He was challenging the war chief's understanding of what strength really meant, using the Varkonians' own cultural values against him. "The warrior poet Clethvar is still sung about in your military academies," Sullivan said, naming a figure from ancient Varkonian history. "Not because he won the most battles, but because he prevented the most unnecessary ones." He understood that true strength sometimes means choosing restraint when destruction would be easier. For the first time since the confrontation began, Gormoth lowered his weapon slightly. The human's knowledge of Varkonian culture was unexpected, and his willingness to stand unprotected between armed enemies was something the war chief had never encountered from any species. "You speak of our legends," Gormoth said slowly, "but you are not Varkonian. You have no understanding of what honor means to a warrior people." "You're right," Sullivan admitted without hesitation. "I'm not a warrior, and my people have never conquered worlds through force of arms. but we have fought wars. War Chief? Terrible wars that taught us things about honor and strength that I think your legends would recognize? Ryan Davis watched the Varkonian warriors and noticed something remarkable happening. Instead of growing more impatient with the delay, they seemed to be listening with genuine interest. Several had powered down their weapons, though they remained ready for combat if ordered. Sullivan turned slightly to address Scholar Prime Vex9, without taking his attention completely off Gormith. Scholar Prime, your people established settlements here under legal authority from the Galactic Council. But did anyone from the collective attempt to contact Varkonian historical authorities before beginning colonization? The Centauri leader hesitated before answering. We followed all required legal procedures, but we did not specifically consult with the Varkonian Empire. Their territorial claims were considered ancient history with no bearing on modern settlement. Rights. Ancient history, Gormith repeated, his voice carrying dangerous undertones. The blood of my ancestors means nothing to your council of bureaucrats and weaklings. Sullivan stepped between them again, but this time he faced the Centauri delegation. Scholar Prime, War Chief Gormith has legitimate grievances about your settlement procedures. His people's connection to these moons goes back thousands of years, and dismissing that connection as irrelevant was a mistake that caused this crisis. Amy Carter watched her captain with growing understanding. He wasn't taking sides in the dispute, but he was forcing both delegations to acknowledge the validity of their opponent's position. It was a technique she had never seen used in diplomatic training, but it seemed to be working. However, Sullivan continued, turning back to Gormith, the Centauri colonists who live on these moons now include families with children who have never known any other home. They built their settlements in good faith, believing they had legal authority to be here. Destroying them wouldn't just punish the council bureaucrats who made the mistake. It would harm innocent people who trusted their government to protect them. Gormith studied the human with new interest. You argue for both sides, yet you serve neither. What do you gain from preventing this conflict? Nothing, Sullivan replied honestly. Humanity has no territorial claims here, no trade interests at stake, and no alliance obligations to either of your peoples. We volunteered to mediate because we believe that preventing war is valuable for its own sake. And you would stand between our warriors and our enemies, even though you have no weapons that could stop us, Gormith observed. Yes, Sullivan said simply, because sometimes the willingness to absorb violence instead of creating it can accomplish what weapons cannot. The silence that followed was broken by Scholar Prime Vex9, who stepped forward despite her obvious fear. Captain Sullivan, what do you propose as a solution to this dispute? Both sides have legitimate concerns, but our positions seem incompatible. Sullivan looked between the two delegations and made a suggestion that would later be studied as a masterpiece of creative diplomacy. War Chief, what if the Centauri Collective formally acknowledged Varkonian historical claims to these moons and agreed to pay territorial lease fees to your empire? The colonists could remain in their homes, but they would do so as tenants rather than owners. And Scholar Prime, he continued, what if your people agreed to employ Varkonian security forces to protect the mining operations? Your colonists would gain protection from the galaxy's finest warriors, and the Varkonian Empire would have a legitimate presence in the system. Amy Carter realized that her captain had found a way for both sides to claim victory. The Varkonians would regain control of their ancestral territory and receive ongoing tribute from its use. The Centauri would keep their settlements and mining operations while gaining protection from one of the galaxy's most feared military forces. But more importantly, Sullivan had accomplished something that would echo through galactic politics for decades to come. He had shown that a completely defenseless negotiator could achieve results that traditional diplomacy had failed to produce. Not despite their vulnerability, but because of it. Gormith and Scholar Prime Vex9 looked at each other across the space, where the human captain stood between them, and for the first time since the crisis began, both saw their opponent as something other than an enemy to be defeated or a threat to be eliminated. The war chief slowly powered down his energy blade and removed his combat helmet. revealing the scarred face of a veteran warrior who had seen too many battles. "Human Captain Sullivan, your proposal has merit. I will consider it if the Centauri are willing to acknowledge our rightful claims." Scholar Prime Vex9 removed her own helmet and bowed formally toward both the human and Varkonian delegations. "Captain Sullivan, War Chief Gormuth." Ambassador Lisa Morgan stood before the assembled Galactic Council as the afternoon session reconvened, knowing that the next few hours would determine humanity's future role in galactic politics. The challenge from Ambassador Cleth9 hung in the air like a storm cloud, as she could feel the attention of 200 different species focused on her response. "Honored delegates," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's advanced acoustic system. "Ambassador Cleth9 has raised important questions about the security protocols that govern this chamber. He has specifically challenged humanity's exemption from weapons surrender requirements, and I believe the Council deserves a full explanation of how this policy developed." Cleth9 shifted in his seat, his recently reattached bone spurs clicking against the metal armrests. "Ambassador Morgan, with respect, explanations are insufficient. The human exemption creates an unfair advantage in negotiations and undermines the principle of equality that governs Council proceedings. No species should receive special treatment, regardless of their perceived weaknesses or diplomatic history." Lisa nodded respectfully toward the Zephyrian delegate. "Ambassador Cleth9 raises valid concerns about fairness and equality. To address them properly, I request permission to present historical evidence that demonstrates why this policy was implemented and how it has affected galactic stability over the past 4 decades. Council Speaker Prime Alpha granted permission with a harmonic tone that resonated through the chamber. Lisa activated the holographic display system and began to show records that most delegates had never seen compiled in one presentation. The first documented case of human diplomatic intervention occurred 39 years ago during the Thraxian Hive Wars, she announced as images filled the air above the central platform. Lieutenant Colonel Beth Adams was serving as a cultural attaché when the Crimson Hive threatened to release engineered plague spores on civilian populations belonging to the Azure Hive. The holographic display showed a young human woman in a simple uniform standing between 2 groups of insectoid aliens whose natural weapons could have killed her in seconds. The Thraxians were a hive mind species that communicated through chemical signals and resolved disputes through biological warfare that other species found horrifying. Colonel Adams walked unarmed into the contamination zone where the Crimson Hive had deployed their plague carriers, Lisa continued. She remained there for 18 hours, exposed to biological agents that would have killed most species within minutes. Her only protection was a basic environmental suit that couldn't filter the sophisticated toxins being used. Ambassador Hive Prime Zek-7 from the Thraxian delegation stirred uncomfortably in her specialized seating area. The insectoid being remembered that incident well, though from a very different perspective than the one being presented. The remarkable thing wasn't that Colonel Adams survived the exposure, Lisa said, manipulating the holographic controls to show medical records. Human immune systems are actually quite vulnerable to Thraxian biological agents. She became seriously ill and nearly died from the contamination. But her willingness to remain in the contamination zone while defenseless convinced both hives to negotiate rather than escalate their biological warfare. The next series of images showed Commander Nick Torres standing on the bridge of a single human destroyer, positioned between 2 battle fleets preparing for combat. The ship was vastly outgunned by either force, but Torres had positioned his vessel directly in the path any attacking fleet would have to take. Commander Torres spent 4 days broadcasting continuous messages to both fleets, Lisa explained. He didn't threaten retaliation or promise rewards for peace. He simply stated that any ship wanting to attack the other fleet would have to destroy his vessel first, and he provided detailed information about the human families who would lose fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters if his ship was destroyed. General Thrak Prime, the massive Brontok delegate, remembered this incident from his own military service. At the time, he had been a young fleet commander preparing for what everyone assumed would be a glorious battle. The presence of the fragile Human ship had somehow made the upcoming conflict feel less like a heroic engagement and more like an execution. The psychological effect was unprecedented, Lisa continued. Both fleets began to see their conflict not as an abstract political dispute, but as something that would directly harm innocent beings who had chosen to put themselves at risk to prevent violence. The admirals from both sides eventually agreed to negotiations rather than force Commander Torres to carry out his promise to remain between them. Dr. Patricia Wells appeared in the next set of holographic records, showing the elderly human physician walking calmly through a battlefield where Brontok berserkers were locked in their species' traditional rage combat. The massive warriors were in a state where they attacked anything that moved, friend or enemy alike, until their biochemical fury burned itself out. Dr. Wells was the first non-Brontok ever to survive direct contact with berserkers in full rage state, Lisa explained. She walked among warriors who were biologically incapable of recognizing her as anything other than a target to be destroyed. But something about her complete vulnerability and her obvious intent to help wounded fighters broke through their combat conditioning. General Thrak Prime stood slowly, his dampened strength still making the floor vibrate slightly. Ambassador Morgan, I was present during the incident you describe. Dr. Wells saved the lives of 47 warriors that day, including my own battle brother. But what you don't mention is that she was nearly killed 3 times during her efforts. That's correct, General, Lisa replied. Dr. Wells suffered severe injuries and spent 2 months recovering from her wounds. But her actions convinced the rival Brontok clans to accept mediation instead of fighting to extinction. The peace treaty signed after that battle has held for 32 years. The holographic display continued to cycle through dozens of similar incidents. Human diplomats and mediators stepping between warring factions while carrying no weapons or defenses. Sometimes they were injured or killed in the process, but more often their complete vulnerability had a profound effect on the beings they were trying to help. Ambassador Seren Prime from the Centauri Collective rose to address the chamber. Ambassador Morgan, the incidents you describe are certainly remarkable, but they raise questions about human motivations. Why would your species consistently risk death to mediate conflicts that don't directly affect Earth's interests? Lisa had been expecting this question, and she answered with the directness that characterized human diplomatic style. Ambassador Seren Prime, the honest answer is that we don't fully understand it ourselves. Human psychology seems to include a strong drive to prevent suffering when possible, even at personal cost. But more importantly for this discussion, we've learned that this trait only works when we remain genuinely vulnerable. She manipulated the holographic controls to show side-by-side comparisons of human diplomatic missions. In cases where human mediators carried weapons or wore protective gear, their effectiveness dropped dramatically. The psychological impact that makes our interventions successful depends entirely on other species recognizing that we've chosen to be defenseless. War Speaker Threnud from the Varkonian Empire spoke for the first time during the session. Ambassador Morgan, my people have learned to respect human courage, but courage alone doesn't explain your success in preventing conflicts. What makes human vulnerability more effective than traditional diplomatic methods? Lisa paused before answering, knowing that this question touched on the deepest philosophical aspects of the exemption policy. War Speaker Threnud, I believe? The answer lies in how different species respond to the concept of voluntary weakness. When a naturally strong species chooses restraint, it can be seen as strategy or manipulation. But when a naturally weak species chooses to remain vulnerable while trying to help others, it touches something fundamental in most sentient psychologies. The chamber fell silent as delegates considered this explanation. Many species had evolved sophisticated deception capabilities and were naturally suspicious of diplomatic gestures that might hide ulterior motives. But humans had no natural advantages to hide, no concealed strengths that might give them secret benefits from appearing weak. The effectiveness of human mediation seems to depend on what we call genuine vulnerability, Lisa continued. Other Species recognize that we have no hidden agenda because we have no hidden capabilities. When we choose to stand between enemies, everyone involved knows that we're genuinely risking everything for no personal gain. Ambassador Clef9 rose again, his frustration evident in his posture and voice. Ambassador Morgan, even accepting your explanation of human motivations, the policy still creates practical advantages in council proceedings. Human delegates can enter sensitive negotiations without the psychological burden of surrendered weapons that affects other species. That's a fair point, Lisa acknowledged. But the same factors that make us effective as mediators also make us unsuitable for many other diplomatic roles. Human delegates cannot credibly threaten military action, cannot offer protection to allies. When the council session resumed, Ambassador Lisa Morgan could feel the weight of galactic history pressing down on the chamber. The debate over humanity's security exemption had revealed deeper questions about the nature of diplomacy, strength, and what it meant to be vulnerable in a universe filled with dangerous beings. Council. Speaker Prime Alpha's harmonic tone brought the assembly to order, and Lisa noticed that several delegates had changed their seating positions during the recess. Some had moved closer to the human section, while others had deliberately distanced themselves. The political alignments were shifting in real time as species reconsidered their positions. Before we proceed to formal deliberation, the speaker announced, Chief Counselor Vex Alpha of the Etherian Collective has requested permission to address the Assembly on matters of historical context. A ripple of surprised whispers swept through the chamber. The Etherians were the oldest member species of the Galactic Council, and their chief counselor rarely spoke during regular sessions. When Vex Alpha rose from the ancient crystalline throne that had been specially constructed for Etherian physiology, every delegate in the chamber gave him their complete attention. The Etherian's form was difficult for most species to look at directly, as their energy-based bodies existed partially outside normal spacetime. When Vex Alpha spoke, his words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, carrying harmonics that touched something deep in the consciousness of every being present. Honored delegates, Vex Alpha began, I speak today of events that occurred before most of your species achieved spaceflight, when the foundations of our current galactic order were being established. The security protocols you debate today were not created arbitrarily, but emerged from hard-learned lessons about the nature of power and the requirements of peaceful coexistence. Lisa felt a chill of anticipation. She had studied Etherian history extensively, but much of their early involvement in galactic politics remained classified at levels far above her security clearance. When the Galactic Council was founded 8,000 years ago, Vex Alpha continued, our primary challenge was creating a system where species with vastly different capabilities could interact without constant warfare. Every member species brought unique evolutionary advantages that could be weaponized against others. The holographic display system activated without any apparent operator, showing images of the Council's early member species. Lisa recognized some of them from historical records, but others were completely unfamiliar beings whose civilizations had apparently vanished long ago. The Krillian Empire possessed natural psychic abilities that could control the minds of other species. The Void Predators could phase through solid matter and strike without warning. The Crystal Singers could shatter molecular bonds with focused sonic emissions. Each species represented a potential existential threat to every other species in the galaxy. Ambassador Clef9 leaned forward in his seat, his forearms tense with interest. Like most modern delegates, he had never heard the full history of how the Council's security protocols had developed. Our solution was to create the Great Equalization, Vex Alpha explained as the holographic displays showed the construction of the first council chambers. Every species would surrender their natural advantages when entering sacred spaces of negotiation. Psychic dampeners, molecular stabilizers, phase inhibitors, and countless other technologies were developed to ensure that no being could use evolved capabilities to threaten others during diplomatic proceedings. General Thrak Prime's massive form shifted uncomfortably. Chief Counselor, that system still exists today. Every species except humanity undergoes neutralization procedures before entering council chambers. How does this history relate to the human exemption? Vex Alpha's energy form pulsed with what might have been amusement. General Thrak Prime, you assume that humanity is exempt from our security protocols. In reality, humanity was the first species we encountered that required no neutralization procedures whatsoever. The chamber fell completely silent. Lisa felt her understanding of galactic politics shifting as she realized the implications of what the chief counselor was saying. When humanity first applied for council membership 50 years ago, Vex Alpha continued, our security assessments revealed something unprecedented. Here was a species that had achieved interstellar travel and complex civilization without developing any significant natural weapons, armor, or enhanced physical capabilities. The holographic display showed early footage of human space exploration and first contact procedures. Lisa watched her own species representatives, looking small and fragile compared to the alien beings they were meeting for the first time. Every other species in galactic history had evolved some form of natural advantage that enabled their survival and eventual dominance on their homeworld. Humans were the first intelligent species we discovered whose primary survival trait appeared to be their ability to cooperate and adapt rather than to fight and conquer. War Speaker Threnod stood slowly, his scarred face reflecting deep thought. Chief Counselor, are you saying that humans never developed natural weapons because they never needed them for survival? Not exactly, War Speaker, Vex Alpha replied. Human evolutionary history includes periods of significant violence and competition. But uniquely among known species, humans developed the ability to choose cooperation over conflict even when they possessed the tools for warfare. This psychological flexibility proved to be their greatest evolutionary advantage. Ambassador Siren Prime from the Centauri Collective activated her translation device to ensure she understood correctly. Chief Counselor, if humans possess no natural advantages that require neutralization, why was the exemption formally codified rather than simply implemented as standard procedure? The ancient Etherian's form brightened, and Lisa sensed that they were approaching the heart of the matter. Ambassador Siren Prime, the exemption was codified because we discovered that attempting to neutralize humans actually made them less effective as negotiators and mediators, not more effective. This statement caused an eruption of surprised conversations throughout the chamber. Lisa had never heard this aspect of the policy's development, and she could see that most other delegates were equally shocked. Early in humanity's membership, Vex Alpha explained, we attempted to apply standard protocols and equipped human delegates with defensive gear and neutralization devices similar to those used by other species. The results were counterproductive, in ways we had never anticipated. The holographic display showed records of human diplomatic missions where the mediators carried standard council-issued equipment. Lisa could see immediately that these negotiations had been far less successful than the legendary incidents she had presented earlier. Human effectiveness in conflict resolution appears to depend on other species recognizing their genuine vulnerability, Vex Alpha continued. When humans carry weapons or defensive equipment, they lose the psychological impact that makes their interventions successful. They become just another weak species trying to appear strong, rather than a strong species choosing to appear weak. Lisa suddenly understood the deeper truth behind humanity's role in galactic politics. Chief Counselor, are you saying that? The exemption exists not to give humans an advantage, but to preserve their natural state so they can serve their intended function. Precisely, Ambassador Morgan, Vex Alpha confirmed. Humanity's exemption from weapons surrender requirements exists because humans with weapons cease to be human in the ways that matter for galactic stability. Ambassador Clef9 rose again, but his tone had changed from challenging to genuinely curious. Chief Counselor, what evidence exists that human mediation has actually improved galactic stability? The incidents described by Ambassador Morgan are impressive, but do they represent a significant impact on overall conflict levels? Vex Alpha's response included statistical data that left the entire chamber stunned. Since humanity joined the Galactic Council 50 years ago, Documented military conflicts between member species have decreased by 63%. Successful, peaceful resolutions to territorial and resource disputes have increased by 217%. Trade wars have decreased by 41%, and diplomatic crises that escalate to military action have dropped by 78%. The numbers hung in the air like a mathematical proof of humanity's value to galactic civilization. Lisa realized that she was looking at evidence that her species had fundamentally changed the nature of interstellar politics simply by being willing to stand between enemies while defenseless. These improvements cannot be attributed to technological advancement, economic factors, or changes in species psychology, Vex Alpha continued. The correlation with increased human involvement in diplomatic crisis management is statistically undeniable. General Thrak Prime stood and formally addressed the chamber. In light of this evidence, the Brontok Confederation withdraws any objection to humanity's security exemption. Our people have learned to respect strength in all its forms, and we now understand that choosing vulnerability in service of others represents a form of courage that our warrior culture deeply honors, Warspeaker. Threnid followed immediately.